For those struggling with negative thoughts, you are not alone, but rather a part of a larger collective who all experience the ebb and flow of the human mind. We all know the voice. It appears unexpected and uninvited in both high moments and low. Like an enemy, it can be harsh and unforgiving. It is the overthinker, the fearmonger, the guilt tripper, the self-doubter, and that's just to name a few. But I have reason to believe that the voice is more of a friend than a foe, like a wounded child rather than an intentional villain. Instead of being shut down and silenced, it requires an offering of space, filled with empathy, reassurance, and guidance. For negativity is neutralized by the power of love, where every part of you can be seen, heard, and brought right back into harmony. Hi, soul friends. I hope this video finds you in well spirits, and I am so grateful that you're here and we can land in the safe space together. I know that if you are anything like me, a human with a brain, then you most likely have experienced the negative inner voice. I think for the sake of this video, we can call it the shadow voice, if that feels good to you. I first noticed the shadow voice as a little kiddo, and over the years, it has shown up wearing so many different hats, from anxiousness to self-doubt to obsessing over perceived flaws and even creating ideals of perfection that don't exist. And sometimes it showed up as all of this at once and then some. For a long time, I absolutely hated the shadow voice. I would almost shame myself for its presence. I couldn't understand why it was there, and I wanted every current and future shadow thought to simply poof away. I just couldn't understand why my mind couldn't be this 100% optimistic, positive place all the time. That was the expectation I had for it. So I would shut it down and dismiss it and kind of ignore its presence. But this past year, I have spent a lot of time with my shadow voice, learning it, understanding it, empathizing with it, and ultimately guiding it back to neutrality. And when I tell you, I have never felt this amount of freedom in my mind. My internal headspace has never felt more clear. So I am relieved and happy to report that my shadow voice and I are no longer at war. And in fact, we are very close friends, a friend that I had misunderstood this entire time. To be honest, I am breaking a little bit of a sweat right now because I've never said any of this out loud. I have never articulated to someone else what this side of my mind looks like or my experience with it. But so many of us have this shared experience, and I've just noticed that there's a lot of messaging out there, especially in the wellness world, to silence this negative inner voice, these negative thoughts. But I deeply believe that healing actually stems from a place of love and gentleness rather than this place of aggression and correction that is often encouraged. So I hope that by sharing the ways in which I've cultivated a healthy relationship with my shadow voice, that you can befriend yours too and experience this sort of mind evolution. Think of any relationship that you're in, whether it's with friends, family, or a partner. In each of these relationships, we create space to hear what that person has to say. When they do choose to speak, when they do open their mouth, we don't just shut them down and dismiss them. And even if we don't like or agree with what they have to say, we respect them enough to at least hear them out. And of course, we can only imagine what would happen to the relationship if we did the opposite of that. And it dawned on me that I am in a relationship with myself and therefore my shadow voice. And although I don't always resonate with what my shadow voice has to say, I realize that it deserves the same kind of respect and kindness and love that I'm willing to share with others. The more that I forcefully silenced it, the more I was left with these feelings of shame and confusion, as if the aggression that I was projecting towards it was rebounding back at me and kind of like polluting my internal world. And this put me in a continuous cycle of creating a hostile relationship with myself because I was in this constant fight of what should and shouldn't be heard. Despite what we often hear, I do believe that the shadow voice is a part of us, and by no means does it define the whole of you, but At least for me, my shadow voice does desire to be heard. It does desire to be seen and have space held for it, just like anyone else would. And just like I hold space for my inner voice that leans more positive or more optimistic. And so when I began to give my shadow voice a chance to at least express itself, to share its deep feelings, I opened up this relationship with it that led with honor for its existence and curiosity for what it was feeling, despite how uncomfy it felt. So, for example, if my shadow voice said, "No one is going to care what you have to say about the shadow voice," I like to sit in silence with that thought and provide it internal space to explore it. And in that exploration, I like to ask myself questions like, why am I feeling this way? And seeing what comes up. What could be the origin of this feeling or this thought? And exploring that and diving deeper. And now that I've given my shadow voice a space to express itself, I can clearly gather an understanding of where this is coming from, why it's feeling that way, and approach it with empathy instead of shame and invalidation. I always think of treating your shadow voice like a crying child, meeting them with a comforting hug, hearing their concerns, validating their feelings, and consoling them with reassurance, letting them know that it's gonna be okay. So instead of kind of pushing my shadow voice back into its hole, I would instead meet it with a hug and the reassurance of, I hear you. I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're feeling. And when I tell you, this made a world of a difference. Taking this approach actually helped me transition from a place of a one-sided conversation where either my shadow was dominating or my more resonant side was dominating. Now it created an open dialogue where I could respond to my shadow voice instead of reacting to it. Sometimes my shadow will say pretty interesting left field things and kind of heighten my nervous system for no reason. I think a good example is like maybe being home alone and my shadow will be like, what if someone broke in right now and kidnapped you? And I'm like, like, it's not funny. It's a real thought. I often like to respond with, hey, I understand that you're trying to protect me or prepare me for the worst case scenario, and I appreciate you for trying to show up for me in that way. Thank you, but I actually don't need that kind of input right now. That is not what I need at this time. And that makes such a difference, just to kind of talk to your shadow self and be like, hey girl, we good. We'll be okay. Like, it's okay. You don't have to do all that right now. This really makes my shadow self kind of back off the ledge. Like, oh, okay, like we don't need to be heightened right now. We don't need to be preparing for this right now. I noticed that the more I met my shadow with open communication and gratitude for trying to show up for me in its own unique way, this unveiled its scary mask to show a part of myself that was either hurting or scared or worried that just needed more guidance to express itself more clearly. Communication is everything. And so now that I can see and hear my shadow so clearly and I can empathize with where it's coming from, now I can just gently guide it back to neutrality. This part reminds me of kind of like rocking a baby back to sleep. That's exactly what I do for my little shadow. So what I like to do is express to my shadow what I'm feeling in actuality. And this helps to replace the negative thought that's existing in my mind with one that feels more resonant. So if the previous thought was no one is going to care what you have to say about the shadow voice, then I may respond with, well, maybe I'm more so nervous to speak about the shadow voice because I've never done that publicly. This is new for me, and that's a valid feeling to have. It may sound silly to go back and forth with your shadow voice, but I promise you, it feels like the biggest love hug you could give to yourself to kind of guide yourself back to this loving, more gentle space than to let your thoughts kind of run rampant in chaos without giving them any attention at all. Sometimes our minds just need a bit of coddling and guidance back to solace. Now that I've brought my shadow voice back to a more grounded state, I really like to introduce at least 2 to 3 positive thoughts to replace the negative one. And this really helps me fill my cup up again with love that may have been drained in the process, and also just brings me back to a high vibrational state. So, in replacement of the negative thought, I will reaffirm my shadow voice with responses like, what you have to say is worthy of being heard. You have and will find a community who cares deeply about your thoughts. Or by showing up, you will impact someone's life in the most profound way. By the time I get to the second or third affirmation, the negative thought that once existed has now been redirected and overshadowed by an infusion of love and light and positivity. It brings in the light where the darkness once existed. Sometimes we have repetitive negative thoughts that take us a little longer to heal through or overcome. And so, if I've already gone through the motions of giving this thought space, unpacking its origins and triggers, then I like to meet it over and over again with guidance and with affirmations until I can get it to a place of neutrality once again. To make this relationship sustainable, I had to set realistic expectations for my shadow voice and not expect my thoughts to be perfectly curated all the time, actually, ever. I don't think that the mind is a place that can be curated, that can be set to a level of perfection. I think it's always going to be a little quirky, and that's okay. Just like our external relationships, we don't expect each other to say the most perfect thing all the time. So I don't think it's fair to our mind to expect every single thought it produces to be perfect either. Especially living in a world that can be quite anxiety inducing and overstimulating. We have to give our minds grace in navigating the intensity and the flight or fight responses that come up just living your everyday life, but realizing that I'm never too far away, that I can always return to a place of intentionality and love and gentleness within myself, that even though darkness may arise, that there is always a source of light, and that I can always take that light and expand it far and wide. I hope that this helps you create space within to explore your thoughts with gentleness and build a loving relationship with the inner voice, with the shadow voice. You can navigate the negativity that may enter your internal environment with love and light and spread it far and wide, and communicate with your inner voice to guide it back to balance, guide it back to neutrality, so that you can make that return back home to yourself once again. You are not alone in this, and if anything, I am right here with you. Thank you so much for joining me today and having such an intimate conversation. Thank you for allowing me to show up just as I am, and I honor you for showing up just as you are. I love you so deeply, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye!